Ed, thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Charity and Susan to raise their hand if you cannot hear me all the way through this. Thank you. And thank you that both of them are with me today, but they also helped me get all these notes together and argued with me about what to say and what not to say, which is always important to have. It is a pleasure to talk about the endowment, but before I do, let me say something as a word of thanks to Ed and to Joel. Those of you like I that have sat around this or these meetings for the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years, I guess, however long we've been doing it, has been a wonderful conversation for those of us that work in foundations. And in a few minutes, some of you that have been coming to them are going to recognize ideas that we have just flat stolen from some of the other presentations that we've had, because there have been wonderful ideas and thoughts as I think all of our foundations try to figure out how do we do this business, and how do we make sense out of the opportunities that we have and the challenges and resources that are at our disposal as well. The last thing, Ed and I had lunch about 10 days ago talking about what to say, and one comment I made to him after coming to a lot of these, I am thrilled that finally there's a speaker that has absolutely, entirely no hint of accent whatsoever. Understand everything that we saw. I did choose the title, Changing While Staying in Place. And Ed and I talked about, that we cover a little bit of the family history because I think it has bearing on some of the things that are happening in 2012. And then take a look at the endowment, both of what we were asked to do and how we've tried to honor that. But at the same time, try to change that and make it more relevant as we have moved into 2012. And actually, it has been these last 8 or 10 years where our trustees, which literally hold the key to a lot of what we do and can do, where they have been unusually flexible given the 86, now almost 87 years of the new endowment, allowing us to look at the wording that's in the document written, probably began its authorship probably goes back to 1915, 1916. That era was made public in 1924. But then if you're trying to operate almost 100 years later, how do you keep that document consistent and also relevant? And thus, my term of changing while we stay in place. Beginning, as I said to Mr. Duke, we have had around these discussions people that represent the wealth transfer of the 21st century. We've had people that would fall into that category of venture capitalists. We have had any number of very current conversations. But if you step back 100 years and look at the great philanthropists of that period, of which I will argue Duke was one, I think you see some common characteristics in there. Characteristics of not trying to do too much, characteristics of focusing on goals and looking for selected outcomes. Charity and I were looking at a page yesterday, which is one of the treasures in our office. And it is a legal-sized page that listed all the contributions the Duke family made in the late 1800s. And at the end of the year, they would divide up among the siblings, and James would be sent his bill for the pro rata share of the contributions they made. And you can see some of the organizations that you still recognize, Lincoln Hospital, Watts Hospitals, who are in various stages still here today, the YMCA, the Duke Memorial Church, along with many other organizations that are no longer with us, were all receiving funds, and some that you see at the bottom of those pages. And it actually leads to some of the interesting comments we get, especially in higher education. Well, Mr. Duke was giving to us, and he really wanted this to have it, but we wouldn't change our name, and so we didn't get the money. Yeah, well, there are about 50 schools that make that claim. What Duke's family did with the endowment were select areas that were important to those organizations. They selected higher education, they selected children's organizations, they selected healthcare, and they selected the Methodist Church, all of which had roots into giving that family had been doing for several decades. And by selecting them, to me what they did was a vote towards focus. And he actually has a page in the indenture which says, I may have chosen other organizations to receive our money, but I think I would have accomplished less in terms of trying to do too much. And I think that says a whole lot to us today about how you choose, what an organization chooses to fund, and more importantly, maybe what it chooses not to fund, and stays focused on those. And as we said from Mr. Duke, they picked these 4 areas, and these still are the areas in which we work today. Interestingly and different from the other philanthropists of his day, which tended to choose social issues, improving humankind, or selected sort of nondescript words. Duke was different in that in 3 of the 4 areas, he chose organizations. And if you think about that difference, that in and of itself brings a certain focus. That you didn't say all private higher education in North Carolina, you said these 3 schools in North Carolina. And so that leads to a concentration of giving that we'd like to think over now 87 years has produced greater results than it might have had they said all private higher education in North Carolina. Now when I say that the endowment became a manifestation of what the Duke family's done, I looked this up last night because I wasn't sure I remember the numbers exactly right. But you talk about the concept, which we have discussed often, of putting a lot of resources in a focused area rather than scattering a little bit of money in a lot of places. In the academic year, 1899 to 1900, the Duke family put $100,000 into Trinity College. Now that would have been a lot of money in that point in time. The state of North Carolina that year put $25,000 into UNC. And the total operating budget of UNC that year was $45,000. So put that in context with what one family was doing to one school, that is a heck of a lot of focus, and that's putting a lot of resources into a concentrated effort.
Gene, you might want to tell people that Trinity College was the ancestor of Duke, but some people here might not know.
Well, that's a good point. And actually, Trinity College was in Randolph County, which is about halfway between here and Charlotte. And we moved here in 1911, 10, 11. I don't remember that.
I want to say 1892.
1892. Okay, but it clearly existed for about 40, 50 years, and then was moved here with the efforts of Watts and Dukes and some of the others. But a lot of money into a very focused area of interest, which is, I think as an organization, something over the years that we may have wandered away from, being pretty general with small gifts to a lot of people. Which you'll hear me say in a few minutes, we think we've come back to a greater focus on that recently. These are just numbers, but they'll give you an idea of the range of our giving right now. By our 4 areas, child care, healthcare, higher ed, and rural church, you'll see at the bottom 8% goes to cross programs and special opportunities. I'll talk about this more, but that is a construct that we've come to in the last 7 or 8 years to deal with questions that hit on the margins of our organization, of our grant areas. One of our challenges, because of 4 divisions that are in pretty disparate areas, is how do you make one organization out of funding patterns that are ranging everything from a Duke University to a 30-member church in a rural community in North Carolina? How do you make sense in an organization out of that? And this is one of the techniques that we've used. So 129 was the grants, and then 113 was distributed in that year. Also, when I say something about place, he was very clear that our funding would be to North Carolina and to South Carolina. And if you look at these numbers, 96 and 29, if you pull out of that the giving to Duke University, which is skewed, and also that our support for Methodist churches is only in North Carolina, not South Carolina, then the relationship between the 2 states is just about 2/3, 1/3. But if you look at population, if you look at number of organizations like number of hospitals or children's organizations, even our colleges, 3 and 1, there's almost always that 60-40, 63, 2/3, 1/3 relationship between the states. As an organization, especially in child care and health care, and in higher ed as well, we really don't see that state line very well. I mean, what we do is done for the Carolinas. It's been very fortunate that we've been located in Charlotte because that's almost dead center for a staff that travels pretty heavily around these 2 states. It does keep us a little bit schizophrenic, however, because you have to stop sometimes and think, no, wait a minute, what is the funding policy in this state? And what does Medicaid look like in South Carolina versus the North Carolina program, or health licensure this does? And as a sideline, one of the questions we often get asked is what's the difference between working in North Carolina and South Carolina? And actually my answer to that has become increasingly over the years, the difference is not as much north and south as I think it is east and west. We sort of have a state that's roughly along Interstate 85 and another state that looks pretty different along Interstate 95. But on those two corridors, north and south, they're pretty similar to each other. And that does affect our grant making as we think more about getting even specific within these two states and trying to accomplish some things in even sub-geographic areas. So let me step a second into our grant areas specifically and talk a little more about how we're thinking about what we do. We have one trustee who's very good about pushing us in his own way, I think in a very strategic question. I don't care as much about the individual grants you're doing. What I need to understand is how are you thinking about the work that you're doing? And if you step back, because I think most of us as program officers get so bought into the relationships you have in recipient organizations and what's going on in this children's home or in this hospital. And it's very helpful to have a trustee to say, wait a minute, pull back, let's get to a higher level and talk about the strategy that you've got in place. And that has, especially in the last 5 or 6 years, caused us to ask different questions and even to the level of changing some internal staff meetings. Let me start with healthcare because it went through this change first. Now, this is a really busy slide. This is actually one that we stole from presentations here. Let me try to explain it.
Are you suggesting that all of our slides are that busy?
No. But there's a logic to this.
Eugene, it's upside down.
It's upside down. Well, what Mr. Duke in the indenture said, I want to support hospitals not operated for individual profit. Okay? So here, the not-for-profit hospital is represented. But then you say, well, but Mr. Duke wouldn't have understand the concept of hospice. He wouldn't understand the concept of long-term care, of inpatient, outpatient care. So what are those related organizations that spend a lot of time, in essence, representing what is a hospital in full, broadest generic term? So we have, when we say resources and partners, academic health centers, not inpatient long-term care, area health education centers, which many of you may know through close, other not-for-profit organizations and operating foundations, which have created things like if you're working in diabetes or obesity, then you'll start seeing some operating foundations show up here. So our trustees over time, and with their, as I said earlier, their flexibility about interpreting words, this has become our efforts to represent hospitals. Well, then what do you want to do with those? If you've got $30-some million given away a year, what are you trying to accomplish with those? And with a lot of discussions with our hospitals, we said, well, the three things we're trying to do in this grant area is improve access, improve quality, and improve the prevention and stoppage of illness in the first place. And this has been very helpful. This was actually borrowed some from Jim Canales in his presentation, if you remember Jim's talk from Irvine not long ago. This has been a thought process that's helped us give order to how you assign $35 million. That's probably, some years may range up to 450, 500 grants. There's a system and a structure to how you think about it, rather than just saying yes or no to what comes in the mail. So then if you overlay that with what we call our special programs, and this represents a very high percentage of our funding now. We've moved dramatically away from being responsive to operating much more of requests for proposals and then responsive within the request for proposal standpoint. So take emergency medical services. This is one that's been operating, we've been with about 10 years. One of the things we know, we will do the data collection. There are about 45,000 EMS providers in the two Carolinas. When you think about it, that's a huge number of people riding trauma vehicles around the states. And there are about 1.8 million episodes of an emergency care during a year. So if you're fitting into that, how do you get your arms around what you're trying to do with emergency care? Well, one of the things we've been working on is how we're building a data system that's based over in Chapel Hill that now has centralized 4.8 million records in the last 8 years. If you get 4.8 million records, you start seeing some pretty interesting trends. You know, how does this county compare to that county? And if you see those variations, then you can start working with those counties and improve that variation. You can also move, and one of the numbers that we've captured and quantified has been a 21% drop in emergency response time, because you're able to figure out those weak performers and move them up and get them closer to what the top performers are doing. Further, if we talk about in terms of improved coordination of care, you can count, and we are beginning to get the systems to count, especially in things like a heart attack. If you've got a trained crew on an EMS vehicle, and they can figure out that the patient has had a heart attack, and you know they're probably going to go to the cath lab once they get to the hospital, why do you stop in the emergency department? There's absolutely no reason to. So with the right kinds of communication and pre-testing, bypass that administrative step, get them on and get treated, and improve that help outcome. I think without some structure of thinking about how organizations evaluate the work they're doing and the grants that they're making, you would just be writing checks over and over into an EMS system without following what's happening from it. Now, this is, as I said earlier, this is the overview chart we have for healthcare. There are similar charts we're developing in each of these special program areas, and now when we have a program officer that wants to propose a new idea, they have to develop this chart and present it internally to our staff. And it goes through a staff review before it ever hits our trustees. Exactly what are the resources? Who else is funding it? What do you expect to get out of it? But as I think organizations think more about how you measure what you're doing, it takes a structure to figure that out. And this is the one that we've tried to use in healthcare. And you'll see this again. Rural church is one that's probably a little later in our conversion change. It started really changing. It historically has been a division that put well over 80% of its money into building Methodist churches. We have a thought process now with our trustees on our rural church committee and with the person that's directing that if you have 1,600 rural Methodist churches in North Carolina, why are you building more? And has the game not changed in 80 years? Work on consolidating some of those churches rather than perpetuating a number of churches that have 30 to 50 members. And there are a lot of them that have 30 to 50 members with one generation. But it is an interesting area because you have an overlay of governance through the Methodist bishop service that you have to work through. So you're triangulating what a foundation is doing with their grantees, but you've got third parties of church governance to deal with as well, which makes it really interesting to move through some of those. So what we've in process, and I put this one in because we're only 3 steps of the 7 or 8 that we want to get through. Again, it's trying to figure out the methodology that we think that will lead us to where we want to go, understanding the data about who and where are churches. If you've got 4 rural Methodist churches in a mile of each other, do you offer funds to each of them to build a playground or a child development center or an after-school program? We think not. That's been a hard sell with our trustees to get to that point. It's a very hard sell with the Methodist Church, simply because it is a very different strategy than we have used in the past. Where we think we're heading with this, and this ultimately will become the type of fish diagram that I had up for healthcare a moment ago. This one is going back to this. When we say environmental scan, analyze data, we're not that engaging of the field. Just how do you engage the field? And then we still have the construction on the lower left-hand side, but you can also see a remarkable shift towards developing leaders in a Methodist church, and also a shift in encouraging outreach. Let me take developing leaders for a second. Of the 2,100 Methodist churches in this state, about 1,600 are rural. Only about 30% of those churches are served every Sunday morning with somebody that has a master's in divinity degree. So you've got 70% of the people in the pulpit that have some type of training, but not a master's in divinity that we all think about our faith communities being led by. So if that many of your churches are led by someone, how good is their training? And how engaged is their training? And so that's what that second one about developing leaders is. And we're working hard to figure out what those metrics ought to be. Lastly, on the encouraging outreach side, if you looked at this list 4 or 5 years ago, there would have been 11 or 12 things on there. And we have slowed in cutting back on things we funded, but trying to put more dollars into fewer subject areas. And we think we will be more successful. I know we'll be more measurable by being able to have a tighter focus around where our dollars go. In child care, this one has been really interesting to work with. This is the one area, I mentioned earlier that Mr. Diggs selected specific organizations to fund. This is the one area where he did not. And in here he said to support orphans and half-orphans. Well, for 60, 70 years, that was identified as the orphanage, because in 1924, the way you took care of a child that didn't have the benefit of parents was to place them in a child care home, like Oxford Orphanages. This is probably the nearest one here, or Methodist Home for Children that's over in Raleigh. Well, in multiple discussions with our trustees, they came around to the realization that a child that's in a single-parent family is essentially a half-orphan. And once you interpret what is a half-orphan differently in light of what the 21st century may say a half-orphan is, then that opens up all kinds of programs that you consider. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, prevent child abuse, any number of things. And so out of that, it's led us to a discussion of all the people that are working with child care, all the different things you can do. Where do you really want to be? And so what we've selected are 2 core strategies, one about prevention and the second one about out-of-home care. Now let me tell you just a moment about out-of-home care. If you pick up a newspaper and you see a child that's been removed from a family, generally they're placed into foster care. The motivation for most of our county social services is to get them back to the family as fast as they can, because foster care is expensive. Now, if the child really is challenged, they will go either to therapeutic or group care or residential treatment being the most expensive. What we think we can help encourage the states to do is to be more orderly in this process by doing more examination of exactly what the child needs. And if the child needs therapeutic foster care, put them there. Don't put them in residential treatment. It's going to cost society so much more and probably not do the child as well by virtue of just being misaligned with where they should be. So this is the continuum that we visualize and work our funding off of and things we try to accomplish with it. The challenges you run into, though, are trying to get people to do the right kind of assessment. As I said, they'll place them in a level too high or too low from where they ought to be. And almost all of these levels, we have way too many providers in child care, which is inconsistent with what most of us think. But because there are too many providers, there's a lot of pressure on the cost side, i.e., there are group homes that will take children for less than others will. And so that begs the question of where quality is. So what our strategy is becoming is trying to reduce the number of providers if we can, but while reducing those providers, get them larger, get them able to provide a broader array of services and get really good at it. And we're beginning to see a fairly significant amount of consolidation in what used to be the children's home networks of mergers of those, which we all think is a good thing. The last area piece that we're working on more and more is what we call post-permanence. If you look at the statistics of children aging out of the foster care system, they're pretty horrible, of unemployment, of bad behaviors, etc. And I think it's irresponsible of our society to say, congratulations, you're 18, you have spent 17 of your 18 years in foster care system, good luck, you're now on your own. I mean, we shouldn't expect a better outcome with systems that do that. All of this leads us down to the documented outcomes that we're looking for. And this, the busy chart that we have for healthcare, these would be on the right side of that, the goals that we're trying to get to. The child that comes through this system, or they come out the other end, educatable, employable, etc., as you see up there. And they're trying to set measurements for each of these. Lastly, in higher education, again, with 4 grant areas, this calls for a different strategy here because we have 3 schools in such different places. Arguably, Duke and Davidson are consistently in the top 10 nationally of their comparative groups. They've been built that way over a long time, and again, as I said, a lot of focus. And so a lot of what we can do is be sure we can support them so that they stay there. I mean, our ability to move Duke higher with our funding is you might move a position or 2, but it's going to be hard to make a substantial change on those. So you sort of develop one strategy around Duke and Davidson, and similar with Furman, which isn't far behind on those as well. One other statistic that I just find astounding, and I don't know this for Duke, but we do for Davidson and for Furman. There were 3 years during the Depression that the money coming from the Duke Endowment to those 2 schools was greater than what they were receiving from tuition. Now, again, long-term focus, staying with a particular organization and goal for a long period of time between good years and bad years. And I'd like to think that those schools, we certainly won't claim attribution, but we certainly would like to claim some contribution to what those schools have become. Johnson C. Smith is interesting with a really distinctive new leader who's trying to fundamentally change that school. In doing so, in his attempt to raise standards and to graduate more individuals from minority-serving institutions, 2 years ago, he took a particularly bold step and essentially cut in half his entering class. And he cut it in half to raise the academic standards. Well, that's a heck of a hit to the bottom line when you cut out that much tuition. And yet, the classes he's taken since then, higher SATs, higher class rank, their retention rate from one class to the next year is getting better by about 10% each year. And we think ultimately they will be graduating more students and more successful students than they had they continued simply an open door policy that a number of minority institutions continue to have. There are 5 or 6 schools that are moving in that direction, and we're really pleased that Smith is one of those that's taken that fairly aggressive step. Again, another fairly busy chart. But on the left side, you see the 4 schools that we work with, and on the right side, the 3 long-term outcomes that we're looking for: academic access, questions about access and affordability, and community engagement. And if you think about, and if you know, those of you connected to Duke well, in our most recent big grants here have been 40-some positions on the faculty side, faculty enrichment side. It's been a major gift for scholarships 4 years ago, and significant funding into programs like Duke Engage. Again, all trying to hit, or being sure we're aligning the grants that hit those targets that our trustees and we have agreed that we're going after. Lastly, and I mentioned this earlier, some things we'd like to do don't fit neatly into any of our 4 grant areas, that they fall on those margins. And it calls for us to develop programs and grant activities that may be a blend of child care, health care, or rural church health care. And we tried funding them through the traditional areas, and we ran into exactly what you think you would run into. Well, is this my money or is this your money? And which program officers lead and which one isn't. And so we decided just to pull all that out and essentially almost create a 5th division and put those projects in there. That was one part of the strategy. The second part of the strategy has been we've become increasingly convinced with as much money as we have, we may be trying to invent too many new things ourselves. And that there are good programs around this country that other organizations, especially other foundations, have tested, have proven. So why would our strategy not be a better play simply by trying to bring some of those programs into the Carolinas rather than trying to invent them ourselves? We've had 3 or 4 presentations from different leaders of Ed McConnell Clark around this table, and that's actually where that concept sort of dawned on us, and we now have 3 active programs in place for that McConnell that we're working. The other thing that this is teaching us as a staff is making a larger commitment for a larger period of time, or for a longer period of time, and instead of the traditional 3 years and out, some of these topics are close enough that it calls for you to be in there much longer time. Let me talk about 3 of these. First one, the one that resonates right here out of Stanford School, and many of you I suspect know Ken Dodge, who has led this program with us, the Durham Family Initiative. This began 8 years ago. We've put $15 million into it. And what Ken has done in the Durham community is go into high-risk families, look at the needs that they had for their children, and find the appropriate referral source to get that child to. Now, in those 10 years of funding, he's measured 15 different indicators. We've had 2 controlled communities in North Carolina, Greensboro being one of them. And so you could look at patterns like for children under 2 years of age, what's the occurrence of going to the emergency department for emergency treatment because of abuse or neglect or whatever, compared to control groups in Durham County and control groups in other communities. And we're really pleased with how that project has gone and with the data that Ken has generated out of it, and now the interest he's getting in that program from around the country. We would have never figured that out in 3 years of time. It took a longer period of time to do that. Interestingly for us, we began with a parallel strategy in Greenville, South Carolina that was not as individual focused as what Ken was doing, but it was more of a community comparison, almost a neighbor helping neighbor model, for lack of a better phrase. That one didn't work, but again, you had the data. We knew that it wasn't working, so after 6 years we shut it down. Now, it wasn't a lot of fun because we had 2 trustees that lived in those communities. And shutting down a program in their community while you were keeping the one going in Durham raised all kinds of interesting questions around our boardroom. But once again, data helped answer that question in the boardroom that we would never been able to answer had we not had that information to back it up. Similarly, in patient safety, which was began in 2000 with the North Carolina Hospital Association. Our model a decade ago, when a topic came like out of the report Error is Human, which came out of the National Science, about the number of unintended injuries that were killing patients in U.S. hospitals. Our traditional response to that would have been see if there were 8 or 10 or maybe 15 hospitals that were interested in trying something, funding them, watching what they did, calling them a model, and encouraging other hospitals to do likewise. That ability in recipient organizations to transfer what some have done to others is really hard to pull off. Everybody sort of wants to design their own, wants to do it themselves. So we reversed direction and went towards a concept at the Hospital Association, well, let's build one data center, one support system. Let's hire the right kinds of people and do it one time for North Carolina. Blue Cross joined us in this. This is from our side. It's been about $1 million a year for each of these 10 or 11 years. But you can go on their website now, click on the triangle, and you can look at all the hospitals in this area. And then you can click on, say, heart attack, and you can see how all those hospitals are performing. Well, a patient may or may not do that. Certainly you're not going to do that if you're having a heart attack. You're not going to look at the website and see who's performing best. Do you know who is looking at that? The providers inside the hospitals. And you better believe they're watching what their competitors are doing and how they're coming on those numbers. And that in and of itself has become a sort of self-reinforcing method of improvement. It's now moved from hospitals into emergency services, coupling up with what we were trying to do with the EMS program, and most recently moved into long-term care. So there's, in both states. The other metric we're trying to use, and it's harder, it's not a perfect science at all, but there's enough information out there through the Medicare systems and reports that you could array the 13 southern states on some of these things like heart attacks and strokes. And you can see a fundamental difference in North Carolina and South Carolina. And again, that's not scientific. You can never write a paper on it, but it does give practitioners a sense that something's working and that you're able to build a statewide system. One of the challenges we have with this, within one organization, being completely honest, if you think about what Ken Dodge has done, that is an evaluation almost to the individual level. And that's one way of counting. When you're doing something like this, it is an evaluation more of a, what I would call a movement. And that is a very different way of counting. And we're not great yet at comparing those two and understanding which issue works best with which type of grant program. Sometimes it clearly is. You need the specificity of getting to an individual level and change at that level. But if you're trying to get all hospital campuses to be tobacco-free or eat healthy or do patient safety, it's a very different mindset of how you get at it and how you approach that, and keeps our staff and keeps our trustees guessing at, are we still doing this right? Have we figured out the best ways yet? The last one I'll speak to comes from our rural church division. This is an example of one that's led by our rural church division that crosses over in our health care. Through the Divinity School, one of the first probes I went to of our rural rural ministers, I was stunned just sitting in the room, looking around the room at the obesity that was represented there. And then in some of the conversations, you heard professionals, generally well educated, but are in careers that are locked in very small communities without a lot of resources. If they've got a master's in divinity, they're probably one of the 8 or 10 best educated persons in that community, so there's a sense of isolation. We think about who's the first provider in mental health circumstances, and it's often not our doctors. It's actually our ministers of the first lines that get hit with that. So very difficult jobs without a lot of resources, and that clearly has an impact on ministerial health. And so our initial baseline surveys, looking at these individuals, it was a marked difference in 5 specific areas, worse than the general health population of North Carolina, especially in obesity, diabetes, heart attacks. And so we have a divinity school that's training really qualified people, but a system over time that's not taking good care of them. And thus the birth of the Clergy Health Initiative. We're 4.5 years into it. So far we're running at about 64% participation, which we're okay with. We wish it were higher than that, but it is what it is. But we're learning more and more about it, and so far out of 3 of those 5, we've seen fairly remarkable improvements with a whole array of things that we're asking them to do. And lastly, this is one of the Edna McConnell Clark projects that you've heard about. We like this one because this represents not only the endowment, the KB Reynolds, Providence Foundation in South Carolina, Blue Cross in both states, as well as state funding and increasingly state funding. We're now in 16 separate projects around the 2 states. What do we like about this one? Again, it was an idea that was out there. It's 30 years old. It's been tested in a lot of places. So what you're really doing is funding fidelity to a model rather than trying to create a new model itself. And our trick now is how do you get permanence in something like this, because it's pretty expensive. But there is movement about making it permanent with things like reallocating the flow of health department dollars from more categorical services to more program dollars. So we're learning about those. But that one really has been, for us, it's been great fun because we've been working with so many different support organizations, and there's a once-a-month phone call that goes about 2 hours of all those organizations getting together, and then they meet once a quarter face-to-face. So we've learned a lot with this one about how we work with other organizations. So in closing, I'd make the point that, yeah, we're 87 years old. We were given a fairly specific charge. We'd like to think we're still very consistent with that charge, but at the same time, pretty different about how we go about undertaking that charge. And Ed, I would emphasize that a number of the things that are in these slides have been things that have come out of conversations around this table, and for that, all of us are very appreciative.
No, thank you. Hey, thank you very much, Gene. That was one important tour of 2 states and 1 major foundation. Well, let's open it up for questions, comments, and
Susan and Terry will be happy to answer anything.
Okay. And we know where you're sitting, so it's all right. Is there enough light in the back, or I don't know how we've got it okay. So let's, we're open, the store is open.
Charles.
I have a question about the methodology that you are applying to these health providers. I think I understood you saying you have metrics that are quantifiable, like
We're getting at it.
rates and things like
We're
this.
getting at it. Mm-hmm.
And you can compare one hospital with another. So in the application of this, what does your board talk about in terms of, is it being fair to the hospital serving a very poor community versus an affluent one, or maybe one that has a more high-risk population than the other? When you have these measures, you'd think that at least one possible drawback is that it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. So what kind of discussions are you having about that?
Charles, good question. There's a fairly major county in northeastern North Carolina that has 4 EMS services. 1 county supported and 3 privates. And so you can see where that conversation goes with the county commission about what's your political will of building one system for this county. Because here's the data that can show you the variation you've got. If you live in the north part of the county and this service is covered, this is what those citizenry is about to expect. So often it's carried out that way, and it is actually the state office of EMS that does that on our behalf. I mean, our staff wouldn't go into that community and make that case, but the people that have that expertise with the state EMS office would do that. But there's a larger question there. Some of the data that we have done, we've done it now twice over 4 years. We're about to do it a 3rd time, which will give us a 6-year range, specifically looking at rural hospitals. And it takes a lot of metrics, but it tries to categorize them. Which hospital is essential and viable, medically essential and economically viable? Which one is essential but probably not viable? Well, when you get down to that 4th quarter, it's not an essential hospital and it's not economically viable. It begs the question, why would you ever put money into it? And maybe your best strategy there is either help that community become something else, like a good urgent care center, or have the hospital aligned with a major system. That alignment with a major system is the strategy that's working best for us right now. But there's one foundation, there just isn't enough money to put cath labs in every hospital in North Carolina. You've got to make choices somewhere, but we're, to the degree you can with data we can get our hands on, we're trying to make it as wise as we can. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Barbara Goodman,
Yes, ma'am.
AJ Fletcher Foundation. Does Duke Endowment, does the foundation do anything in policy and advocacy and putting money in that?
In policy analysis?
Say the advocacy.
And about advocacy, it is more by a major grant area. There's our most active areas with Nurse Family Partnership.
But not working to change
Not
state policy or for y'all even higher?
yeah, there are some we have done with some Medicaid policies, because that directly
Is that
affects.
just not in the mission or not really the will or?
We're just not particularly good at it yet. And we've got we put in place a we put in place a contract with Capstrap about 4 years ago, and they're helping us learn how to do
Really
that.
is.
We've got another contract with a law firm in Columbia that helps us with strategy in South Carolina, but it's not what I would call many foundations do, with a very clear out front public policy stance. It's much more aligned to specific projects that we're trying to undertake.
Gene, what's Capstrap?
Somebody brought it. Jerry can help me with this one.
Can you,
No, you're right.
so,
It's a marketing communications from
a very big one.
With the advocacy bias.
Yeah,
Yes.
marketing, communications, lobbying on
Right.
some issues. Bullet.
And they're excellent at what
Pretty
they
much full
what they
service
do.
It's good to see you again, Tim, by the way.
Yeah, well, listen, thank you. And I'm actually just having a flashback, which I want to ask you about. We were part of it. We were standing, I think, on a levee in New Orleans. I know we were standing on a levee in New Orleans, and you were looking out over either Lake Pontchartrain or the Mississippi River. And when we were talking about, you were conceiving at that point sort of the notion of thinking, the Carolinas needs to do something about disaster prevention and sort of working with some foresight in that. And I'm less interested in whatever came of that notion that you had, and more, I mean, feel free to talk about it, but you might also just think about you in this role over 30 years at the foundation. Are you more or less inclined at this point to be trying to put that thinking cap on for what the Carolinas needs 10, 20, 30, 50 years out?
Next question, please.
I got a harder one.
Yeah, it's Tim, we do that. I think we try to do that. I think we do it reasonably well in the 4 areas that we fund. What we're not as good at is how do those 4 areas intersect with other things that are going on. For example, I talked about our working in child protection and how with $10 million, which is somewhat limited for 2 states, how you really focused with that. Well, one of the decisions we made was to pull back from after-school care and afternoon care. Now, that was a hard call on our part because there's every reason to be in after-school care, and yet, can we go deep enough in some of the other areas to get at that? So that discussion about where our child care strategy is going with larger K-12 issues, we're probably not as good at that as we ought to be, would clearly like to be. One that we are trying to think through, and we're early into it. And again, one that came from Jim Pinellas with Irvine. you know, 2 states, even though they're only 2 of 50 states, they're awfully big. I mean, that's, what, 11, 12 million people now. Should there be times where we focus in sub-geographic areas? For whatever reason, by whatever diagnosis, you know, is there, not that you turn your back on the rest of the state, but do you add particular additional focus to these 3 or 4 counties for whatever reason? And we're trying to think through that. An example, if you follow things like Department of Commerce, hearing 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of 4 tiers of counties about how well they're doing economically, you look at those counties just west of Hickory, North Carolina, which have all moved from fairly stable economically to pretty bad shape. Well, what happened? Well, they lost the furniture industry. And so now you're seeing really bad outcomes. So would we be better, or should one of our strategies be develop a particular focus with the people we can fund in those particular areas? And we're trying to figure that one out right now. But not so much in 20, 30 years.
Let me follow up on that, because I think it's very provocative. We're in a state, or 2 states, where industry has shifted dramatically, and certainly in furniture and so forth, tobacco, and it has altered the living standards and the economics of, I don't know South Carolina as well as North Carolina, but very dramatically. You've got 4 program areas, 3 of which are not centered on a specific place. How do you take into account, as you're building and developing projects, how do you account for an external variable which is out of your control? But at the same time, you want to do good work, and it may be like mercury on the tabletop. You can't get it to slow down and stop. How do you account for these economic mega shifts in terms of the programming that you're doing?
Again, a great question. I might fumble this answer. You're right, those shifts are out there, and we're in 4 pretty static areas that aren't changing. There are times that we would love to have more flexibility. I mean, if you, for example, if you think about the pipeline that goes in, you know, you're charged to fund 4 schools of higher education. So that begs the question, what's the pipeline that's feeding students into higher education? And then if you want to make those schools stronger, should you be in K-12 education? Well, we weren't charged to be in K-12 education. And you go one step further, of our 4 colleges, only one of them has a teacher's program, Johnson C. Smith. Duke, Davidson, Furman don't train teachers. So you've got recipients that aren't producing a product into an area that that is very key to a pipeline that you care a lot about, but it's in the coldest, hardest word, you don't really care about them until they become freshmen on campus. So you really do have to pick, I don't know if I'm getting at your question now, but you do have to look at what you can do, what you really can address, and what you can't. In our healthcare division, if you really want to work on a workforce, the place that you could impact workforce in healthcare is at community colleges. Clearly, I mean, that's 70% of the nurses in North Carolina train in community colleges. We can't touch a community college without going through all kinds of hoops. So you're right, that's when an indenture written 80-some years ago gets awfully constricting for dealing with issues today.
Well, it's fascinating to watch how you've been making the shifts you can make and continuing to find
And figure out where you just can't go.
those places.
Anthony?
I was on the flip side, we have unusually long institutional relationships and partnerships over time. And so I'm wondering how you keep those sort of relationships fresh and not stale, because it's easy to fall into a comfortable role where one might enable whatever spark of genius might be in the leadership of a big institution you're working with. unfold. On the other hand, if there is no spark, then there could be discomfort. On the other hand, you could also be the catalyst that pushes the change. And so I was just curious, thinking about how the Duke Endowment sort of navigates that, especially in a week that we have now, the Martin Luther King celebration. I was wondering, so the issue race, for example, has been prominent throughout the Carolinas over time. And in education and in healthcare, race has been a very important issue over time. Does the endowment sort of see itself as in a push role to change the segregation, for example, or does it see itself in that type of social change role with respect to the institutions with which it has long-term partnership?
Let me see if I can get, I think you've got several questions in there. One, about the long-term relationship. In an odd kind of way, a long-term relationship is easier when you have to say no, because a good long-term relationship, they understand that it is a no about this specific question, and that the relationship's intact, and you may say yes 5 more times, but on this one, we just fundamentally disagree as friends. And I like to think that's what happens most of the time. There's also a dynamic in healthcare. It works in childcare. We've got multiple choices. I mean, if you want to do a diabetes program at an academic health center, you've got 6 places you can go and kind of get the best bid. So that builds in a little bit of competitiveness among some really good providers. That's less effective because we only have one divinity school. So when you have one divinity school and then 4 colleges you're working with all the time, you shift to that long-term relationship, and just among friends, we disagree to disagree on times and try to get to that balance that you can find wherever that equilibrium is going to hit. As far as the race question, we're fortunate in the Duke family from Washington Duke's time on were Republicans, when Republican was the Liberal Party. And in our indenture, it's speaking real clearly. The actual words of hospitals, either white or colored. Some of our early data was ensuring that you were counting both races. 3 of our 4 schools were co-education early on, before it was a trend to do that. So we had some built-in advantages simply because of the political views of the Dukes. It made it a lot easier.
With respect to these educational institutions, I'm just curious, who says the no? And I'm curious, is it oftentimes the initiative of the university to actually make the overture a particular initiative, or is it the foundation that actually has the vision for where the institution should aspire, perhaps inconsistent, as you point out, with the Republican ethos of the founder?
Anthony, it's in some of these programs, like the big 3 we did at the very end, we probably worked on those 18 months or more before we wrote the first check. And that was a lot of conversation with the recipient organizations about what's doable, what's not, where do you build boundaries. Even our last major gift to Duke, which was admittedly capital for Union and all, we had those discussions, Susan, what, 2.5 years? I think probably before. And we spent a lot of time on that one as an example. So why capital dollars? I mean, why, in the priorities of Duke University, why is it these buildings that are important to you? It's not about just building a building for building's sake, but how is it used? How does it impact student life? What are our choices if we're going down this road? Why these buildings? There's a whole array of questions that get into that decision.
And I think if I remember correctly, in that discussion, you also did some of an overlay of social issues related to that capital investment. Similar to, in my mind, Kresge and how they reformed their capital giving, to where I believe that you guys involved some consideration of energy use or environmental consideration, which I think gets to your question where the funder can really push some social issues in the relationship, because ultimately you do hold the amount of zeros or the ultimate number. Right?
Exactly.
But I also, what I find fascinating about this is that your primary donor died relatively shortly after setting up this foundation.
He died 9 months later.
9 months later. Which, if you think about most donors and most funders and foundations, they have the ability to evolve with the original donor, and that evolves how the foundation might approach something, where you're working in this sort of indentured way to this document that he didn't really have the chance or opportunity to evolve with the foundation. And so can you speak actually to how you've gotten this? I like the title because I think it appropriately describes what you've done there. Can you speak to how the board relationship and the staff relationship, how it's been to kind of change that perspective from the previous working relationships to now?
It's if I could ask Duke why he did some things, some of the questions I would have asked was, why did you not put a term limit on your trustees? As a practical matter, most of them will step down in 75 or so, but there's not an official mandate that they serve 12 years or 20 years or whatever. It's they're appointed, they're appointed. He also had has a requirement that our trustees meet 10 times a year. I mean, you think about 10 trustee meetings a year. Now, again, in 1924, his concept was it would be the same board that was governing the university, governing the power company, governing the endowment. And with transportation and communications in 1924, that would require a lot of meetings to cover those three organizations. But it's still written in the will, so our trustees meet 10 times a year. What that does give you is an awful lot of familiarity. An awful lot of familiarity. And for the most part, that's been a good thing. And I think as staff, we've learned that as the word goes, timing is everything. And sometimes our ideas just aren't right today. We shelve them for a while and we come back at it again. But it's, those are the questions I would love to ask Mr. Duke why he did that. I will say, we have been exceptionally fortunate with some of our trustees and their respect for what their role is versus staff. For example, we had a former governor of South Carolina who was also a U.S. cabinet officer. When he was elected a trustee, I thought, boy, this is going to be a problem. I mean, a governor with everything you have to do to get elected a governor, I can just see what's coming. And he did get a lot of people that went to him for access to the endowment, but not a single time did he say anything but, Gene, I got this letter, would you write me a response? He never said how to write that response. And more times than not, that's been our experience. Not always, but generally it is. But I think it's, in sort of a convoluted way, because they are physically present 8 times out of the 10. It is a conversation that pauses more than a conversation that adjourns, if that makes sense.
Let me just push on that a little bit. So the founder dies 9 months after the indenture is written and moved.
Trustee. His daughter didn't participate to a great degree. His wife did. She resigned in the 60s. His grandniece was appointed the trustee. We have, and then his daughter died in the 90s, so there were always at least 2 family members. Right now there are 3 family members on the board. They have been, to me, absolutely astounding at their ability to recognize that it is a private foundation and not a family foundation. They participate as one of the 15 trustees. There's often a nod of what I would call graciousness to them, sort of a glance over the shoulder and to read a facial expression. But that's very different than a family member saying, as a block we're voting this way, or the family feels this. I can not remember a single instance where they played what I would call the family card against the other trustee. And I have great respect for them for that. But because they don't, that's why I think that they have earned and received a nod of looking over the shoulder to see how they're reacting.
It sounds like a remarkable record if you go to the earliest of the Dukes that we were talking about, for a family to be, not have as many blow-ups and crazinesses as some I've worked for and others here have worked for, and so on. And it's been quite consistent, which probably has helped your grant making and your getting the job done.
Yeah, it has. His daughter, Doris, who many of you will recognize, we were probably fortunate. She ended her participation in the late 50s, early 60s, and from then on to her death in 94 did not participate. That's probably a good, healthy thing. She did, I think, put places at risk. There's a provision that our trustees cannot sell Duke Power stock without a unanimous vote of the trustees. Well, she wouldn't come to meetings and we couldn't get a proxy, so we couldn't sell any Duke Power stock. Until, when we did start at her death, we were still 3% of our holdings were in one company. So if Duke Power had had a 3 Mile Island, we would have been a much smaller foundation very fast. At her death, we started selling that stock. It's down to about 1.5% of our holdings today. That was probably the greatest risk that she put us at, because of that unwillingness to let us sell. And interestingly, in her foundation, which is about the same size we are, there was not a single share. Which actually got a lot of comment when we realized, when that was realized.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Gene, indulge me for a second. You have about $3 billion, and if this year you gave away $130 million, $129 million, it's about 4%. And bonds don't yield 4%. Are you able to dip into the corpus of the foundation if you need to? Is question one, please. And question two is, how much could you give away to needy people beyond the 130 if you had it? Is it limitless, or is it, when you have your 4 categories, of course, it restricts it, but how do you call that and get down to 100? Last year it was under 10 million, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. It's actually, we operate on a total return investment basis. So the concept of income we've not really used for the last 5 or 6 years. It's not been a factor probably for the last 10, as long as we've been on total return. So we take that, that calculation the foundations do on that 5% average of assets, and that drives it. We really monitor 3 numbers. There's a total cost of operation percentage, a taxable rate, and then our giving rate. And we try to keep those around 5%. The governor on the upside are our trustees. And some just, they get really nervous if we start getting above 5.5, 5.6. But equally, they get nervous if we get under 5, we start hitting 4.8, 4.9, then they start questioning whether we're doing enough. So we're operating pretty much in a range of that, probably 4.9 to 5.3, 5.4 on a flat giving rate every year. Does that answer? And actually,
how much could you give away if you had it? I mean, you stopped at 130 million. Do you have worthy causes of substantially more, or is that?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting question that we haven't fully answered yet. We've been that 5th area that I talked about, the really large programs. We are entertaining a concept of, could you, in essence, escrow grant money for a great opportunity that comes along? There are a couple of foundations that are doing that. We're looking at how they've done it, so that you have a pool that you really could be extremely strategic with if you wanted to. And we're intellectually dealing with that right now. Just how would you do it? What kind of purpose would qualify for pulling it out? Etc. As far as the income, if you take if you take the original gift of 40 million and you bring it forward with normal inflation, it's about, I should know that number. I would say it's about 800 million. And so that difference between 800 million and 2.8 where we are is just pure gain. So theoretically, you could give away all of that without inventing the corpus.
Thank you.
I'm happy to give you this, and I just don't remember right offhand. I can visualize that graph because it's something we keep up with. But we take that original $40 million gift, inflate it by inflation, so you know what that number is in 2011.
You're having to give them the data, but not the 2 billion, if I got that. Just one. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, actually, well, no, it sparked another question in regards to sort of that impact investing movement and utilizing more of your corpus or even your investments, program-related investments and so forth. Have you had that discussion with the board? Have you considered it? Because I know it sounds as though much of your investments and much of where your capital was restricted to some degree for a while.
It was for a while, but it hasn't been much at all recently. Actually, we were right on the verge of doing that when the market sank. And our strategy for doing it, we've put a good bit of money in our 4 schools around environmental sustainability. And we thought that was a place to start program-related investments because our trustees know the colleges best. And we could have done it around environmental sustainable activities, which has an easily calculated payback. And we just haven't pulled that trigger yet, but it's on our spending plan every year. Now, it has been every year for the last 3 years. It just hasn't passed yet. But I think Susan and I are ready to roll with it. We can get everybody talked into it. But we had talked about actually going, before the market sank, we were going into it with the idea of maybe 10 million for environmental sustainability for higher ed, and then maybe another 20 to 25 for healthcare and environmental sustainability. So yeah, we were that close and then pull back with the market.
Let's have a couple more questions, if we got them. Tim?
I'll take advantage to go again.
All right, this is your last one. It's hard.
Well, you alluded already to the endowment concentration. I wanted some reflections on that, so that was a lovely story. Thank you. It was a bit of a sort of an odd twist in history that doesn't get talked about very much. I was more curious about you as a leader, and just sort of as over your time as you've grown into this role. What's influenced you? Have there been training programs? Are there mentors that you've looked to? I'm going to set you up a little bit by saying more than many foundation leaders that I've ever heard, you reference other foundations and how they've influenced you. There's an element of humility to you and acquiring knowledge and borrowing. It's really wonderful, practical, and humble. So I'm just wondering, what shapes you, or how do you seek to be shaped as a leader?
Well, thank you. You're very kind. But honestly, that's when I became president, one of the charges the board gave me was a thought that we have been too much in the Carolinas, and we have been too much in the 4 areas where we're funding. We have not thought expansively enough about what a foundation our size ought to be doing with national organizations, or what you can learn from them and bring it back to the Carolinas. I actually have found other foundations to be amazing sources of just how do you do this. Next Sunday and Monday, I have an opportunity to sit with 6 other foundations, their CEOs. We're all about the same asset size. We all have about the same number of staff in the mid-30s, but we all have a geographic limitation. And to sit there for 48 hours talking to 6 other people that are doing exactly the same job, to me there are a few ways of getting it better. And I think one of the things we have tried with our staff is, if it is communications, if it is HR, if it is general counsel, find those commonalities in this business and talk to them. And I think that for us has been the single most successful strategy we've been able to find, because that begets a relationship that lasts a long time. And we were recently got a notice that every foundation hopes to get in their morning mail that you get, congratulations, you're being audited by IRS. Well, it was very handy to send an email to the other 6 foundations, so who's been audited? And 2 had, and they gave us very nice comments about, well, we structured it internally this, we have an outside firm watching us for this. By the way, interestingly, we got our refund checks for those 3 years before we got a notice from IRS. We thought it was really odd, but we were glad to get the checks back and the notices. But that's been the big piece of it. And I think organizations like what Ed does and these programs right here have been enormously helpful. In its worst days, philanthropy and foundations are still a lot of a cottage industry. That we think there's one way to do it. I've been surprised and somewhat disappointed that all of us essentially have our own back office operations. I'm not sure why we all do. I don't know if we get into a pretty technical area of grant work, why we couldn't share a program officer with another foundation. I think there are a lot of things that foundations can yet do that we just haven't gotten to yet. But in sense of full disclosure, actually KB Reynolds and we have talked about, since we both fund in health, we're in different ends of the health spectrum of what we're trying to do. But are there not places that we can share some of these resources? And we think there are, and they may yet develop.
One more question. Barry?
I have a question about the rural church program.
We do too, actually.
And forgive me if I misunderstood what you said, but I understood you to be saying that you were interested in consolidating some of the smaller churches, 30 to 50 congregants, and that the Methodist Church itself, I don't know whether that meant sort of national structure, region, state, whatever, was just a good idea. And I was wondering, the church is not something like education or healthcare or whatever, where, efficiency really should be maximized. I mean, I feel like if the church wants to be inefficient and not run according to perhaps the most sensible principles, I wonder why the endowment feels it should be pushing the church in a direction that it doesn't want to go.
Yeah, to a cynical side, some of the churches are going to take care of the consolidation themselves because they're one generation churches and they're going to be gone in a few years. And we lose a certain number of churches every year simply because you get there. One of the reasons that a church ceases to have a minister is health insurance. Health insurance gets too expensive for the church to pay. And so they will drop the minister, and then you've got a congregation that's trying to be a congregation without leadership. That's one of the reasons we're placing emphasis on leadership. Where it gets complicated for grants, though, is that you may have that 50-member church, and there are lots of them around the state. They think the next thing, what's going to save them is a 10,000-foot fellowship hall. And if we'll give them money for a fellowship hall, they will become a 300-member church in short order. And it just isn't going to happen. And so it's not that we're forcing them to close as much as we're saying, no, we're not going to help you do some of these things that you want to do. And that if there are a couple of churches around, we won't help you with a child development center, but we will help the 4 of you build one that will take care of 50 kids instead of your church taking care of 10 and your church taking care of 10. That's what I mean about the efficiency. One of my favorite lines is churches have to be divinely inspired or they'd have been gone a long time ago. And you're right, and that's not in our purview just to close a church. Actually, even merging some of the churches would be a lot simpler if there wasn't a cemetery there. Because one of the greatest burials is my dad's buried out there on that hill, and I'm not about to leave it. It's tough, and so you end up, in some respects, with it, I'm sorry, we're not going to fund you anymore to do those kinds of things. It gets slightly more complicated for us than it does a little bit in child care. There are organizations with Methodist heritage that think we ought to be funding them because of that Methodist heritage. Our counter to them is we fund you because you're good at what you're doing, not because of why you're there. The Methodist Church also gets complicated because unlike some denominations, when you graduate with a divinity degree at a Methodist church, you're essentially guaranteed employment. And so the church has an awful lot of ministers that they're carrying, however you want to define carrying, where in other churches that don't have that ecclesiastical sort of guarantee, it gets complicated. So then, if you couple that Methodist heritage of essentially guaranteed employment with churches that can't afford to support a minister, then are you not better trying to build a stronger church that can indeed support a minister and then help answer that supply problem? So when I say churches are very interesting, very, very interesting, and very complicated place to make ransom.
What's happening to Methodist membership in North Carolina? North Carolina.
Well, I have to say first, it is declining. I have to say you're asking a Presbyterian, so I'm not.
Well, okay, what's the Presbyterian membership?
You're thinking fast.
It's probably parallel.
They are. Most of the mainline denominations peaked in about 1960, 61, and have been declining since then. We're seeing, especially with the growth of Latinos in North Carolina, they tend to be first evangelical, but secondly Roman Catholic. I guess I would have anticipated the Catholic move, but I've been surprised at the evangelical joining that they have done.
Well, it's happening all over Latin America.
It is, and so Methodist, Presbyterian, and other traditional mainline denominations just have not fared away as well as they certainly have not paralleled the growth of population in North Carolina.
But that's a reason in itself to consolidate, leave aside rural.
Well, I'm happy we had the chance to at least touch a little bit on religion. I think in the time that I've been here, we've rarely had the issue of religion come up as in one way or another connected with philanthropy, and it is a subject that probably deserves some more conversation in the future. But we will save it for the future. For now, I want to thank Gene for being with us, giving a terrific presentation. We really